Welcome everyone to day 2 of our symposium on locating sex work on conversations on care. This symposium is funded by the Sociological Review Foundation as part of their seminar series. And it's also co-hosted by the LSE Department of Gender Studies and the LSE European Institute. So I am Sharmila. I am one of the conveners of this event, and with me co-convening is Niina. So yesterday, what we did was we had our keynote panel that spoke about the different registers in which the framework of care and social reproduction can be used in discussing, understanding, and analyzing sex work. We had a panel that talked about care, control, and carcerality, another panel that talked about sex work activism and organizing, and a panel that talked about alternative readings of agency, pleasure, and labor. And we've had participants from all over the world talking about sex work, activism, and care and control in different contexts. So just to give you a quick overview of the preoccupations of this symposium before we move on to today's panel, what we are trying to do in the symposium is think about care in relation to sex work. We're trying to explore the boundaries between care and control in the dominant political thinking on sex work. We're trying to probe interventions that center a framework of care. We're also thinking about care as potentially transformative and disruptive, and looking at how sex workers can point to ways of arranging social relations that provide alternatives to our current understandings of solidarity and care without exceptionalizing sex work, as was emphasized by our speakers yesterday. And today, we are going to be thinking about how an ethics of care might be formulated in research practice, especially keeping in mind that sex workers are over-researched but are an underrepresented population in academia. So what are our obligations when undertaking sex work research? And throughout these conversations, we also reflect on the ways in which we talk about sex work and care, including grappling with and navigating the risks of framing sex work as caring labor and social reproduction, because it is not without risk, and the multiple scales and registers of this conversation. So as I said, welcome everyone to day 2. I'll be chairing the first panel today, and I have an exciting lineup here. So we have speaking first, Dr. Katie Hale-Jarris, who is a lecturer at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University. So all the way from Queensland, Australia, which is really exciting. Our second speaker is Doris Murphy, who is a PhD candidate in Sociology and Women's Studies at the University of Cork, right? And finally, Michael Pastor, who is researching online male sex work, masculinity, and privacy for his MPhil in gender studies at the University of Cambridge. So I will be inviting Katie to speak first, and I'll just give you time signals.
Oh, it would help if I took myself off mute. There we go. Thanks. Thank you so much, Sharmila, and thank you, Niina, for hosting this. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video just so I'm not distracting, and then I will also start sharing my slides. Maybe. There we go. All right. I hope that all these things are not over.
All good.
All good? Okay, great. Thanks. There's things on my screen, but I'm not sure if they're showing up elsewhere. So, okay, great. So yesterday afternoon in her panel, Camilla noted as she was moderating that there has been excellent work done in the last 15 years by sex worker activists and allies, both in engaging with community-engaged or community-led research. And I think that while we acknowledge that this shift is happening, it's also important that we have to start thinking about the limitations that exist within the university itself in supporting and fostering community engaged and led research. And I think acknowledging as well as dismantling these limitations are vital, not just for sex workers, but all marginalized communities, and really moving forward in self-directing the research that they want to see. Oh gosh, sorry. There we go. I'm not sure what I did. So just to back up, the number of students who are sex working in universities has continued to increase. So as recently as 2015, it's doubled from 1 in 50 students in the UK to 1 in 25. That was in 2019 before the pandemic. And a number of researchers have noted that they actually believe now the number is closer to 1 in 10 students in the UK have engaged in sex work. There's similar rates reported in Australia and Canada, with between 3 and 10% of students reporting that they've engaged in some sort of erotic labor during their university studies. And ironically, of course, most of this sex work is motivated by just the growing cost of higher education itself, that as tuition and the cost of living in cities continues to increase, so too does the number of students engaging in sex work. Well, there's a relatively small proportion of students overall who are engaging in sex work. If we flip this and then look at the proportion of students who among sex workers, the proportion grows quite significantly. So in a Melbourne-based study, and this was in 2008, so quite a while ago, but the most recent one that I could find, 40 to 50% of workers in Melbourne-based brothels, at the time, this was the only legal way to engage in sex work in the state of Victoria. That has since changed just within the last month. Sex work has been decriminalized in the state of Victoria in Australia. But 40 to 50% of workers indicated that they were full-time students. So the number really is growing. And I think what that means then is as the number of sex working students does increase, we also then are going to see an increase in sex working researchers as these same students go on to pursue postgraduate studies if they are not already enrolled. And there is an increasing pressure on marginalized people to then become researchers in their own community. And this is where we get into the discussion of the benefit of lived experience when doing research. Partially, this is implicit, but there often is explicit pressure as well, rooted in the belief that researchers with lived experience will see community issues that outsiders do not. As an example, university-based research on sex work. And just to note, when I say research going forward, I almost exclusively mean university-based research within this talk, unless I note otherwise. University-based research on sex work has traditionally focused on topics such as sexually transmitted diseases, sexual assault by clients or client-initiated violence broadly, and the tension between control, circumstance, and coercion around the decision to engage in sex work. However, when sex workers or their close allies design research, we see a much richer tapestry of subject matter, including community aid, such as witnessed by this symposium, criticism of carceral care, consideration of sex working youth, barriers to more legitimized employment, and to toot my own horn for a moment, the impact of gentrification on street-based sex workers. So researchers with lived experience may also be aware of data sources that outsiders are not. My favorite example of this that I routinely ask when I go to conferences, I will kind of seek out presentations where someone is talking about violence against sex workers, sit through the presentation and then ask if they're aware of bad date sheets or ugly mug sheets. Overwhelmingly, the researchers that I've asked this question or posed this question to have not been aware of these data sources. And the use of the lack of use of these data sources is really quite sad, because rather than being able to use something that the community is already producing and already investing in, and in fact, we've used bad date sheets to track violence over time in place, to look at socioeconomic demographics of perpetrators and to consider that offender typology. Instead, we're subjecting people to the same types of very traumatic and triggering questions, asking them to relive their experiences of violence and victimization, we being researchers in this note. Finally, there is the belief, and I think rightfully so, that researchers with lived experience will also have an easier time accessing people in marginalized communities, as they already are a member of that community, have that cachet and those networks built up. All of these are important rationales for encouraging researchers with lived experience to write about what you know. And this leads to this kind of imagined research process where there will be more researchers with lived experience who enter the university or the ivory tower. That will result in more community-initiated research, and that there will be more research then that is tied to reform or action and is largely self-directed. However, if that's the idea, then how do we get this? This was a note a friend wrote to me when we were invited by yet another group of researchers from a public health school to attend and talk about possible research partnerships. This was when I worked at a sex worker-led syringe exchange in Washington, D.C. We arrived at the meeting, and the meeting was yet again proposing to look at violence and sexually transmitted infections amongst street-based workers. And she wrote this on a memo pad and slid it to me halfway through the meeting. So how do we keep ending up with these same research projects if there is a growing number of sex working researchers attending university? And to that end, I think we need to start talking about and thinking about the gatekeepers that exist within the research process itself. So for those who may be unaware, researchers are not entirely autonomous individuals within the university. They first have to put together a project proposal or a research proposal that is then submitted to a research ethics committee in the US. This is sometimes called an institutional review board. And these committees were, I do want to note that they were started with the best of intentions. They were established to reduce physical harm caused by research, most notably after the uncovering of things like the Tuskegee and Willowbrook state school syphilis experiments in the United States, the Nazi medical experiments that happened in Europe during World War II. However, over time, their discretion and focus has really expanded. So they've expanded beyond just the concept of reducing physical harm to instead having discretion and ability to comment on both the methodology as well as what they think is appropriate within the research itself. And often these decisions are made not on the basis of presented evidence by researchers, but on the beliefs and attitudes that those research committee members hold about certain groups. And as you would perhaps expect, as people who control what research is happening, there is a surprising lack of research on them themselves. So we know now that most research committee members in a university are comprised mostly of university members. However, there are some attempts to kind of address those gaps, that's assumed gap that exists between the researcher and the researched. And that is held up in the role of the non-academic or non-scientist member. And this person kind of acts as the go-between in some ways, giving voice to people who may be more vulnerable or giving voice to the lay community. And in many countries, there's federal legislation governing who should be part of the ethics committee themselves. In Australia, for example, this requirement is found in the National Statement on the Ethical Conduct of Human Research and states that at a minimum, each ethics committee membership should include at least 2 lay people, 1 man and 1 woman, who have no affiliation with the institution and are not currently engaged in medical, scientific, legal, or academic work. In the United States, the requirement is less specific, but falls under the federal code and mandates the establishment that an IRB shall be sufficiently qualified through the experience and expertise of its members and the diversity of members, including consideration of race, gender, and cultural backgrounds and sensitivities to such issues as community attitudes to promote respect for its advice and counsel and safeguarding the rights and welfare of human subjects. And as I noted, the purpose of such community members has been couched with this ongoing discussion that such members are more likely or able to represent the views of marginalized communities. So they represent life outside the ivory tower of the university. And yet in most research, non-academic and non-scientist members seldom fit this expected identity. The two large-scale surveys of community IRB members that have been conducted note that over 70% hold advanced degrees. They're typically recruited to join by academic and scientific members themselves, so by faculty members, suggesting that they're from those same professional and personal networks, making them demographically similar. Beyond being similar to their AS peers in educational attainment within these studies, community members seldom saw themselves as representing or belonging to vulnerable communities. And when asked in one survey who they represented, they most often indicated that they represented the lay community, educated individuals who were unfamiliar with biomedical or other research terminology. So what is important to note about this is that ethics committees do have this setup where there is supposed to be an individual within the committee who kind of speaks or gives voice to those who are more marginalized. However, we don't know a lot about who those members are. So that's kind of the quick recap up to this point. I also noted that there has been little research. So we decided to do some research in Australia where there's been none, looking at who these members actually are and what their attitudes about sex work were specifically. So we surveyed Australian ethics committee members about their beliefs and attitudes towards sex work. We interviewed 55 or surveyed 55 participants. However, the response rate is unknown because my ethics committee said that I couldn't actually send it to individual committee members. I had to send it to the committees and ask the organizer or chairperson to forward it. So I still don't really have a good idea of how many members sit on the committees within Australia. And we use something called the Attitudes Towards Prostitutes and Prostitution Scale, which was developed by Levin and Piled in 2011, to look at attitudes towards towards sex work and sex workers. And this is an important scale just because it includes over 40 statements about sex work and sex workers, and their reactions can then be plotted upon a theoretical axis that ranges from, as it notes here, from normative to deviant or choosing to victimization. So as Levin and Piled explain, the normative approaches include views of and they use the language of prostitutes and prostitution, I should note that, as inherent functional aspects of normative society, and those presenting prostitution as a profession freely chosen by independent normative women. The problem-oriented approaches include views associating prostitutes and prostitution with personal or social deviance or with abuse and victimization. So this really goes beyond seeing prostitution and prostitutes or sex work and sex workers as bad or good, but thinking about how ethic committee members really situate this theoretically. Oh my gosh, there we go. And what we found was that overall, there was no difference between academic members or community members as kind of expected. And overall, ethic committee members held what I'm terming here centric deviant views and their views of sex work. So if I can go back without this falling down, I don't know, I can't circle it on here, but you'll see they all kind of fall to the bottom of the perpendicular line there. So more towards the deviant end of that scale. However, despite the fact that there was no difference really between community members and academic members, community members were more likely to be asked to review protocols. This was not statistically significant, but it was by quite a large margin. And so what does this actually look like in practice? So what this actually looks like in practice then is this belief that sex workers and sex work is rooted in kind of what Leon and Sadame note as kind of the damage-centered approach to sex work. And because of this, this really influences decisions that are then made around sex work research. So this can include things such as disallowing the use of cash or general gift cards for sex work research on the basis that such cash or general gift cards could be used to buy alcohol or drugs. The inclusion of something which I eventually typed up and came to call the PIMP protocol, which was this imagined scenario that I would get questions about on a number of ethics applications, asking me to describe what I would do if either myself or a sex worker that I was interviewing was attacked by their pimp during the interview. So I've typed up this kind of ridiculous, fantastical response about how I would respond to this. And despite oftentimes presenting quite a bit of evidence that this was just kind of an over-the-top imagination with violence, it doesn't stop the committee members from coming back and asking about this. The other thing is that it also means that there's has been easier approval processes for traditional research that focuses on sex work as uniquely violent. And to kind of provide two more examples of this, I have some feedback here from other applications that I've submitted. The first of these was from a study that I proposed to do looking at occupational, or looking at the primary causes of mortality by occupation. So I was comparing sex worker mortality within Australia to 3 other occupations listed here: construction workers, domestic workers, and taxi drivers. And I was really, I don't know that cheered is the right word, but really buoyed yesterday to note that others noted they were also using these comparison groups. And of course, I had chosen these comparison groups because they're all used here at discussions in comparison to draw comparisons. Committee actually kind of noted and went ahead here and said that they were concerned about the disparity between the inherent safety of the 2 groups. And I noted, or I've added the emphasis here because this 2 groups note is important because there's actually 4 groups, but they've just kind of already on and reduce this down to 2 groups. So there are sex workers and everyone else. And that is something of particular importance. They also note and kind of get ahead of themselves and anticipate what they expect I'll find. So given the disparities in inherent safety, I'm so sorry, between these 2 groups, assuming that sex workers are less safe, even though there hasn't been.
Katie, just 2 minutes to go.
Yeah, okay, great. So this is kind of an important example of how that frames the feedback that is provided. The second study was proposing to do what's called a correspondence study. I'm actually, I'll stick with this one. A correspondence study is where you send out resumes. You've somehow changed the resume to note employment responses to that different treatment. And in this case, we were looking to see if disclosing history of employment about sex work made a difference in receiving callbacks. This project was not approved by the ethics committee at my university, despite the fact that this is a very common methodology that's been used all over the world. And the concern was that it would actually be harmful to hiring managers. So rather than kind of looking at or prioritizing the considerations around a group which we know has received quite a bit of prejudicial treatment around employment matters, the concern was that this would be really trickery or misleading to hiring managers and the business itself. So I know I'm running out of time, so I won't say a whole lot about it. And this is what the actual research process ends up looking like for researchers with lived experience. You have more researchers with lived experience who join universities. Those researchers experience pushback from the university processes themselves. The proposed research is changed and suspended, and then that research that happened continues to focus on those supposed problems rather than what the community actually wants to see and to move forward on. So in conclusion, ethics committees are largely established to speak for vulnerable marginalized populations rather and to provide space for them to speak themselves. There's often concern how beliefs and attitudes about a group of people can impact what research happens. And this is not only a sex worker problem. I'm working on a paper around this, also including the viewpoints and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. A number of our students the same issue. So when thinking about that kind of famous motto around research about nothing about us without us, we also need to think not just about research subject matter, but also focus on the process itself. So I'll go ahead and stop. I'm happy to take questions at the end. Bella?
All right, thank you very much, Katie. I think what we'll do is we'll just have everyone speak and then take questions at the end. So thanks, Katie, and I would now like to welcome Doris.
Hi, everyone. Now, I hope that this all goes well. Okay. All looking good. I'm going to slideshow. Okay, Sharmila, will you just tell me it looks okay?
Yep, all good.
Great, super. Okay, so this is a work in progress. It's just kind of me reflecting, I suppose, on what I've been learning all year. I'm in my second year of my PhD research, hopefully of 3. In University College Cork, like Sharmila said. So that's in the very south of Ireland, if any of you don't know, and it's very beautiful. So I do recommend you all come along. So my plan today is basically I'm working with the Red Umbrella Front and some other organizations like the Sexual Health Centre in Cork, SWAY, which is the Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland, and a number of other kind of groups. But I suppose the Red Umbrella Front have been helping to shape my research. So they're a sex worker-led collective who officially formed, I think, in 2021. And so that's the rough that you see here, the RUF. Okay, so my plan is to kind of go through what I'm talking about, basically. So the feminist ethic of care in sex work research. So feminist, I suppose the idea really is that, as a lot of people discussed yesterday, sex workers can be feminists. Sex workers don't have to be feminists. Not all feminists are sex workers. Not all sex workers are feminists, etc. But I suppose I'm coming at this from a feminist perspective, following, I suppose, people like Audre Lorde and Sarah Ahmed as regards kind of the idea of care as self-preservation, as proving, for people who don't matter, that kind of idea that looking after ourselves, or people who are construed to not matter, that it's important that sex workers and others actually care for themselves, and that in itself is quite maybe transformative. And then again, like yesterday when Nikki and Charlotte from ECP were talking about Selma James, and again, the wages for housework, it's coming much more from that feminist background and that feminist understanding than from some of the other people who were mentioned yesterday that we won't go into in depth, but basically the maybe more carceral feminist or governmental feminist or state feminist organizations that, might be known by lots of different acronyms, etc. But today I'm trying to keep it light and positive. So I'm not coming from that side. I'm trying to come from a wider understanding. So again, things like Feminism for the 99%, that book inspired me an awful lot. And so again, that's Titi Bhattacharya, Cynthia Rutza and Nancy Fraser's work. That's the kind of school of feminism that I'm coming from. And so that's the feminist. Okay, as regards the ethic, I should say as well, sorry, that all of the rest of these images are ones that were created by the Red Umbrella Front, and that they use on their Instagram and social media and things like that. And so I suppose this is the idea that I am trying to actually follow I'm trying to follow the ethic of care that I'm talking about, in that I'm following sex workers and following what they are saying, I suppose, and listening and trying to learn from. So that's what this is about. So this was an image from I think it must have been International Women's Day, March 8th. And this Women's Day includes sex workers instead of supporting laws that hurt us. And so that's what I'm trying to do, I suppose, with my research, and by, I suppose, participating in things like participatory research, or trying to at least be informed by it. So as Katie mentioned earlier, institutional review boards or ethical review committees sometimes make this quite hard to do, but trying to make them adapt to you rather than vice versa, which again can be easier said than done. But this is coming from, I am not engaged in sex work, and I have many privileges, so it's about trying to put them to work, I suppose. So for example, one thing that came up was that I was involved in a community research module in my college, my university, and I mentioned how difficult it was to try and work participatory methods into the standard form, you know, because they want to see everything in advance, and you're saying, well, I don't have any of that in advance because it's not about me, it's, you know, all the co-creation, etc. And the module coordinators really were interested in that, and one of them, it turns out, was like this, the vice, I don't know what, he was the second in command on the ethics committee, and he said, well, we're reviewing the form for this year, do you want to give me 3 ideas? And I said, yes, I sure do. He's like, just 3. So they integrated those into the form. And so now there's a line, so where they're asking to see every bit of your documentation, there's a brackets, and I can't remember the exact wording, but basically explain, if you were something like, if you are using participatory methods, you know, explain the process that you'll be following here instead. And so I'm hoping that will make it easier for the next person. So yeah, again, trying to use what we know about what's broken in the systems and what makes it hard to do good, careful research, and trying to use whatever leverage or power or privilege we have to make that better, I suppose. Also, I suppose it's important in the ethic, and again, this has come up quite a lot yesterday, about those kind of narratives of, you know, happy hooker versus, you know, sex slave, or these kind of, you know, very simplistic stories or binaries, etc. And I think I mentioned it yesterday that Maggie and Alison and their whole story, their project, I think it was in the northeast of England, a peer talk, hidden stories, and again where they mentioned this idea of biographies of difference, and that it's not up to us to flatten out stories to fit a narrative, it's up to us to make everyone's minds maybe expand a bit more to understand all the different stories that are there, and move away from the really simplistic framing that more carceral feminists, etc., sometimes use. Okay, regarding care, I won't bother going through all the big definitions in that, because you've heard a lot of them over the last while. I suppose where I see it applying to my research is as regards learning from what sex work communities are doing. And this is an example on Trans Day of Visibility. The Red Umbrella Front had this beautiful drawing, I don't know if drawing the right word, this beautiful image. Trans sex workers, we see you on Trans Day of Visibility and every other day. So that is, I think, the most perfect kind of encapsulation of intersectionality, and community care and kind of big picture thinking that you could ever come up with. And so like yesterday, I know some people talked about the kind of romanticized ideas of care, academic ideas of care, and utopian maybe ideas of care. But I think if we can't do that big picture thinking, you know, we're at nothing basically. So I suppose what I see care in this idea is that we're going to be doing our big picture thinking of like big societal structural changes, but also taking care to come up with concrete steps that we can do, like, so concrete steps that I can do as an academic researcher or whatever, and concrete steps that everyone else can do, so that you can tell people, well, actually, lawmaker, legislator, etc., this is what you do. And so, yeah, concrete steps, but that are very much with the view of big scale change, systemic change. Okay, as regards sex, this another beautiful diagram or image from the Red Umbrella Front. I can't remember what this acronym means. International Day Against Hate, maybe, I'm not sure, but again, it's I wrote it down somewhere, but I can't see it now. So basically, again, you can see it's the newer pride flag that's including and merging all of the different kind of identities. You've got your intersex, trans, you've got Black and brown people, you've got all of the kind of queer flag as was, and that we as researchers and whatever else, and as people, that we commit to this, I suppose, commit to the intersectionality, commit to refuse the binaries that people will use. And also, as regards the sex, maybe part of it, refuse the titillation that comes when you talk about sex and sex work and sex work research. When people say, ooh, it must be juicy, or, you know, like, ooh, spicy or whatever, refuse it. No, don't engage in that fetishization or objectifying or subjectifying or whatever terms you want to use. Refuse it, refuse that. And you don't have to be a boring whatever, but I suppose like following Sarah Ahmed and Feminist Killjoy, yeah, tell them, to make them challenge people to do better and be better. So that's kind of where I see the sex part. As regards the work, there's always one click to add text left somewhere. As regards the work, this is an excerpt from the Red Umbrella Front's Whorephobia blog, which I've included the link for there. And this was about, again, these kind of concrete steps that people could take when they experience whorephobia. And so it's trying to, again, responsibilize people, responsibilize the community and society to actually make the difference. That there's no point, you know, same as everything, there's no point sex workers being the only ones fighting whorephobia, there's no point, etc., etc. You know where I'm going, like all of the isms, it's not up to the affected community to be the ones challenging it. So this is the kind of work that we have to be challenging everyone else to do, and that we have to actively do, I suppose, on the daily or whenever we experience it. And so for me, I suppose, again, that idea of privileges, and I always just think of Spider-Man, and with great power comes great responsibility. I have great power, and so I have great responsibility to, you know, like, and again, it's very utopian, but it's not. It's utopian, big picture thinking, but actually concrete steps towards that. And so again, like, I don't know, heal the world, make it a better place sort of thing, but using all of our tools. And I think people sometimes when they hear privilege are like, yeah, okay, but actually use it. Like, I tried to explain this to a cousin of mine one time, who was kind of saying, I just don't get it. Like, why don't you just do finance or something where you can make loads of money? And I was like, well, because I have brains coming out my ears, so I may as well put them to good. And she's like, oh, okay, I get that. And so that's the idea. Like, that's what I have. I have the theoretical and all of the the things that come with that, I've had the opportunities to live that life where I've been very lucky to have this access to education, and so put it to use. And to think about all these things and to be of service, I suppose, to the community, in that whatever I have, I don't know, is it Bourdieu's, all the capitals, use all of those in a way that people want, that the community wants. And then as regards to the research, again, even just Katie before me, and there was a lot of talk yesterday about the different research. I suppose I remember I was at the decriminalization colloquium that was had back in 2020, just before the big C really got going, I think it was in Cambridge. And I was asking, Nikki had presented at it, and I was asking Nikki, what can we do? And she was like, if I get one more email from a researcher being like, I'd love to do, participatory research. And then, it's all very much still extractivist stuff. So rather than that we listen to the demands and the work that's already been done by the community. So for me in Ireland, the Red Umbrella Front, they have this list of their radical demands. And I know as you all read through them, you'll know a lot about them. And, I think we'd all agree that they're not radical in any sense, but because of where we're coming from, they are seen as radical. And so to put ourselves to work in trying to design research that will lead to these steps, I suppose the outcomes that they want are there. So how can we go about doing research to support those outcomes, I suppose? And so again, this is where things like the ethical review, etc., can be such a pain, because that is not how they want it done, because of all of the white tower, ivory tower, whatever stuff. They don't want that. So we have to, again, as we're saying, we're working with the community, but not for us advancing our careers. And so a practical part of that, let's see, there's a chat, hold on, last 4 minutes, perfect. A practical part of that is co-authoring is definitely important. And you'll see that in people who are putting a lot of this to work. There are, I can think of in Ireland, Rosie Campbell, Billy Stoica, Becky Lacey, Miriam, I can never remember Miriam's surname, and Lucy Smith. That's a co-authored paper between service providers, the community, and a researcher, and all of their names are on the list. And that's actually important. Like, it's important if you're in the academic world. It means diddly squash to most people, but it's something that is an active show. And also, I would say, rather than, again, I don't know, maybe easy. I'm new to it, so I don't know about all the ref stuff, etc. But I think absolutely that we should be the second and third or fourth author, because we're taking their story, we're taking their words, and again, trying not to do it in the very extractivist or whatever, that kind of term. We're trying not to do that. We're trying not to do all of the bad stuff, I suppose, because we're trying to do this careful research. And so, I mean, you're the contributor. You're contributing theoretical frameworks, maybe academic language, but you'd have none of that without the community. And so that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I'm just thinking things through. I know it'll come out and it'll be my PhD, but I think PhD is, I don't know, PhD is a certain particular thing. But this is maybe, again, going big picture, thinking how I want to go forward with my research. And just to finish up, I had a really lovely, I was just at a nice workshop the other day in Cork. It was Jackie Good, who I think was in Loughborough University. I'm not sure, is she still there? She kind of semi-retired maybe, but she was giving us a lovely workshop on autoethnography. And it was about, kind of telling your story first and doing the creative bit first, like tell a beautiful story. And then like what changes it from an autobiography to an autoethnography is about kind of applying the theoretical kind of framework to it, or making, maybe adding in some nuances to the original story without making an academic paper necessarily, that kind of allow it. So in my head, when I was thinking about that, I'm trying to take the auto out of it. Like, the story is everything. So my adding of, like, me translating, I don't know, intros and conclusions or whatever it might be into academic language, and references and APA or Harvard, whatever, citations, is only a little part of it. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at the moment in thinking about that. So thank you so much. I don't know, where am I? Can I go into my references for some reason? Oh, there we go. So there's loads of references, even though I don't think I actually talked to you about any of them, but these are all the things that are framing my thinking at the moment. And thank you. That is me.
All right. Thank you, Doris. And we now move on to Michael. But before that, I just want to tell the audience that if you have any questions, you are free to message them to me privately already if you'd rather that I read them out after the entire panel has presented. Otherwise, I can call on you to raise your question as well. But let's first move on to our last presenter, Michael.
Good morning, everyone. I'm looking for my presentation. Yeah. So can you let me know if can everyone see it now?
Yep, we can hear you and we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So pretty much this paper is more of me writing about my reflections and critiques and concerns on doing sex work research, particularly involving men, because I think much of the conversation on sex work has always been about women, and I think we still need to bring in the stories of male sex workers, trans sex workers, non-binary sex workers, because I think the studies about them are severely lagging behind. Now, so I would like to outline first key context before I go through some of the major parts of that paper. This is based on 2 ethnographic field work that I've done, first in 2013 to 2014, where I explored the artistic and visual dimensions of sex work. But this one will be specifically referring to male strippers / macho dancers in the Philippines. And then in 2019 to 2020, where I focus more on issues concerning masculinity, particularly its local conceptions in the Philippines and the cultural dimensions attached to it. And there are also important nuances to be made. First, gay bars in the Philippines functions as a strip club. So as far as we are concerned, there's a clear distinction between what a gay bar is and what is a strip club. At the same time, in terms of corporate registration or entities, gay bars are registered as restaurants. So there's that kind of a legal loophole that sometimes brings into question, are these legal or illegal entities? Or should the activity that they conduct inside be considered illegal? So it's still quite ambivalent in that situation. And again, it boils down to the point that these are not gay bars in the traditional sense, as to what I have experienced here in Western context, that when I go to a gay bar, I see fellow gay men, I can actually go mingle, have a chat with them. It's not the same case to that one in the Philippines. Now, first, for the status of male sex work in scholarship. So Philippine scholarship on male sex work remains scant and underdeveloped, which indicates limited engagement in contrast to its global counterparts. Despite the limited work, writings have explored the connection of sex work to HIV/AIDS, and I think this is very strong, particularly that the public health context is unavoidable, and the focus on sexual orientation and gender identity. There's also explorations about the role of drug abuse, exploitation, and interestingly, representation, because if one looks at the visual representation of sex workers, there's an abundant representations of macho dancers, especially with the local filmmakers as early as the 1980s up to the present. Now, despite the diverse context of male sex work, I would briefly note conceptual disconnections, especially with the terms male prostitution and male sex work, because interestingly, there's a need to use the term male to indicate that a man is engaged in prostitution, whereas in Philippine legal scholarships, and I'm agreeing with Sharmila on this in her work, that much of the legal definitions have focused mostly on women. So this impresses that to some extent a male prostitute is a legal aberration to an extent, that it's something that is unimaginable by law, making it potentially exempted from legal punishment. And any form of legal punishment that is placed on male sex workers are just simply for show, meaning it's just a way to depict that the state is doing something to address the problem of male sex work. But in reality, these are not really reported on a large scale, and there's not much documentation involving them. Now, this, as I've mentioned a while ago, this reveals the exclusion of men, LGBTQIA+ individuals in the scholarship. Now, when it comes to the statistics on male sex workers, it remains bleak. And to some extent, if you would want to make a totalizing conclusions or generalizations about this group, it will be considered implausible. Remedies on these problems are limited and context specific. So one way that Filipino scholars have done this is to categorize male sex workers into groups. For example, the masseurs, the one that were working in spas, call boys the street-based sex workers, and then you have the macho dancers. So this already reveals a diverse context in male sex work, and this can now be extended into online context involving escorting, and like especially with the pandemic that happened, the use of digital platforms and social media platforms like OnlyFans and those kind of things. This helps. I think what's important with this, recognizing this diverse context, allows us to identify the locations where specific type of sex workers can be found. So in this way, we can make a much more focused exploration on them, which is what I did in most of my work, because I focus heavily on macho dancers. So it somehow resolves sampling issues, and this is done through different ethnographic works in the Philippines. However, sexual orientation and gender identity remains an issue because male sex workers are either perceived as heterosexual or homosexual. So there's also that tension with the scholarship and with how male sex workers assert their sexual identities. Much of the scholarship would assert that they are automatically, to use the local cultural term, gay, the equivalent to bakla. So there's always that presumption, mainly because of the sexual acts involved. Some of them are involving having sex with men, and then if to use MSM as a term would then be addressing or reinforcing public health discourses towards them. So one way to resolve this tension, and I will be proposing this eventually later on, is that I think there's a need for us to recognize the sexual identification that sex workers would do. And I think the problem is that while there are extraction that's going on, sometimes even the scholars themselves are doing prescription, that we tend to impose labels without clear understanding that maybe the sex workers do not really identify with this kind of label, and there's a need for us to further nuance those things. This is very important because one of my informants back then have specifically noted, I do not know what my gender, quote unquote, I do not know what my gender identity is, but I do find pleasure with having sex with men. So that already brings in a question of, when I asked him specifically, what's your sexual orientation? He just simply mentioned, I'm enjoying the sex. So there's that kind of interesting dimension out there. So are you gay or are you not? Especially with some people's obsession in labeling people. Now, at the same time, male sex workers also have to contend with the stigma that comes with them being sex workers and them being subjected to public health discourses or HIV. So meaning there's that a different level of stigmatization that's going on, because you have them, they can be stigmatized for being sex workers, and then they can also be stigmatized for being sources or possible spreaders of HIV. So there's always that risk that's involved in sex work for contracting, especially for men, but the kind of disenfranchisement and discrimination that they can experience is appears on different levels. Now, in terms of knowledge production with sex work, male sex work, I would like to highlight 3 important concerns here. Security issues is very important, especially with police apprehension and the violence that happens to sex workers. And this is very important because during my earlier works, the major concerns has been your research has already been called unethical because of certain biases that some of the ethics committee would automatically implement with my work. But they also raise security concerns, particularly that some of them were worrying that I might be part of any news reports that shows about gay bars being raided, and given that much of my research is within the gay bars themselves, there's always that kind of fear for them, especially this is apparent. The term bagansya or overnight jail time occurs, but this one mostly punishes street-based sex workers. But in instances of raiding gay bars, it does happen. Okay. So because of these security concerns, certain limitations have been imposed, particularly creating a distinction between what's a high-end and a low-end gay bar. And this one is something that I had to formulate because I have to clearly strategically identify which gay bars are considered quote-unquote affluent in terms of their resources, their fame status, particularly if they are the one that has that influence or popularity amongst people. And at the same time, the differences in practices. One interesting note is that most high-end gay bars would basically just have striptease, while some of them would really do strip shows, really having some of the dancers having to show their erect penises on display, while there are certain low-end gay bars, which has been excluded in my dataset, and something that I've visited personally outside of my research practice, that some of them would still do live sex shows. So there's that kind of dimension. And there's really the question of security, but it also presents a data gap with this differences in terms of practices among establishment-based sex workers. And then at the same time, the manner of getting the information from them has something to do with the very dynamics of the gay bar itself. And my interviews have to be done inside the establishments, meaning I have to utilize the very role of magic dancers as guest relations officers, which means I have to quote unquote book them for 1 hour inside the premises of the bar, have the conversation with them while they're working because it's part of their job. And then, so which means my role as a researcher coincides or conflicts with that of being a guest. And at the same time, the match dancer's role as a respondent or an informant also coincides with him being a guest relation officer, which means he has to attend or to entertain. So there's one thing that's unavoidable is that the transactional nature of gathering data information here is very important. And this is very evident during my first study because there's an issue of age, because I think I was around 22 at then. There was no institutional support, everything I had to spend on my own. So it was a very expensive field work, which I could share some information later, maybe during the Q&A. Now, I also want to bring in some major concerns or some important points to make up, because gay bars can be considered chaotic and unstable field sites because there are a lot of negotiations that have to be done. First is, I was originally advised to do not disclose your status as a researcher. Just enter the bar, explore, observe, and document what you know. And when that suggestion was made, there was already the discomfort on my part because I think I have to let the people know that I am doing something in the bar, that I am researching there. So instead of following that advice, I decided to simply approach whoever the manager or who are the ones running the gay bars and simply tell them of my intention to do research. And I think that kind of transparency was pretty much important because the questions that constantly arise when I was, especially during the table process, is that are you not a member of the police? So which means there's also that kind of precaution on their end to verify if you do not mean any harm. And it was very interesting because I have to tell them I'm only 22 years old, I'm still a student. I have to totally explain my position, my situation, to fully convince them that I'm not a part of the police, I'm not a police agent. And then what's also interesting here is that while I recognize that gay bars are business establishments, it is an opportunity to also build trust and rapport, which was very useful when I went back to the field side before the pandemic occurred, because it was easy to do the negotiations because some of the people I've known are still there. It was easy to talk to them that I would want to continue or do a research again. They were like, okay, just go inside. So the constant visit to the gay bars also meant building rapport and relationship. But the challenge was when I returned the second time, some of the people I know were already gone. So there were instances that I have to go back, take a step back, and build new sets of connections and ties. But to some extent, the reputation that I am a researcher and I am always quote unquote spending big quote unquote amounts of money, on average around $100 on one visit, simply just to get have the conversation with the dancers and everything else. Those kinds of practice somehow cemented my status. Like, okay, to some extent, somebody would call me or tell me, "Uy, si Madam nandito," meaning, "Hey, Madam is here." So, to some extent, it gave such kind of privileges that I'd always get the best positions or the best views inside the bar and everything, having a much more quick service and practices. All of the managers talking to me. So there's that also interesting change of treatment that resulted from the years of being engaged with this establishment and with this group of sex workers. Now, but however, while doing the field, there are uncontrollable situations, particularly the practice of area. And this is where certain dancers, and there's a select group of dancers in almost every gay bar I've been to, that are tasked to do strip shows, which means they are the only ones over and over again that would go on stage, perform with their penises erect and publicly on display. And the area is the practice that the lights inside the gay bar would dim. It will go dark whenever the dancer goes down the stage and goes to each table and solicit money, get tips from the guests. And in those situations, that's the only way to for them to get some tips. So there's interesting dynamic there, because I only found out, I think, around after a week of being in the field, that you have a way to prevent the area from happening. When a dancer approaches you, you simply just have to signal them that you don't want, so they obviously withdraw. But at the same time, some of the dancers would be aggressive, that even if you are also tabling or in a conversation with someone, with a fellow dancer, they would still insist. And these also reveal power dynamics within the club, that for some of them, for the sex workers, they invoke the question of, you have to respect because this is my guest. You don't have to go and get money or tip from them during an area. And then the problem of sabit, or I think something commonly known that strippers would you would clip the money on their underwear. So this is also something that's being done in the bars. I think a few more slides. Yeah, so I think 2 more slides. Some of the ethical decision making that I have to make here is that first, I have to recognize my role in the knowledge production, because my gender identity has always been attacked, and this is very alarming for me, because by the looks of it, much of the people who are doing research or earlier studies on sex work in the Philippines actually involve, especially if local scholars, most of them are gay men. And I still have to encounter a few straight identifying heterosexual individuals who would be very interested and invested to study sex workers. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you would want to study male sex work, I think being a gay person would somehow have a very strategic position. But the problem was, my identity is being used against me. So whenever in my writing, I always tell that I occupy a role to play, that I recognize that there is a personal interest going on, that yes, I'm a gay person. I mean, why would I research female sex workers where I would not be so interested in them? So there's this kind of dimension, but it also created that kind of critical distancing, that, hey, I know that I am gay, but it doesn't mean that I am that my goal in my research is to actually find someone, have sex with them. No. And I can clearly assert all this time that I haven't had any sexual encounters with any of my informants, even though there were instances that I was the one being forced to have sex with them. And the only way for me to do it is to actually, end the transaction right away. For example, here's the money, here's the gratuity, we can stop this conversation. You are free to go back to your table. There were one instance that one of them strictly followed me until I consented to them. So there were indeed clear security risks. Next concern would be confidentiality and anonymity. For this one, the interesting thing here is that strippers already assume code names, and in the research, I don't have to use the code names, because if I use it and someone seems to know where are the field sites that I've been visiting, there's that risk of identifying who these dancers were. Now, consent is also a tricky situation here because I think what happened was I first sought permission from the bars, so from the managers, before I managed to ask consent from the dancers directly. So what happened here is that some of the managers would definitely brief the dancer first that I am doing research. So it's to some extent that much of the discussion on consent was verbal, at the same time ongoing. So from the establishment down to the dancer, but I always make a conscious decision to discuss more in detail to the dancers once we sit and talk beside each other, that here's the research, here's what I am doing, here are the things that I want you to tell me, here are the things that I want to know as well. And then the data validation also happens at the same time while we are having the interview. So I give them the full control of what data I should use. So meaning whenever they tell me stories and information, I type them using my phone, because back then the only way for me to not write, because everything was dark and chaotic, was to use a mobile phone to document everything. And then I let them read everything that I wrote and check and exclude which are the ones that I should not include or something that's wrong and everything else. And I think payment has been a major concern. I think there's always that tension when it comes to payment. I can discuss this more maybe in the question, the Q&A, as I'm running out of time. And then for participant selection, one way to implement here is to set up parameters, which I did. But one of the challenge, yes, but one of the challenge was there were personal biases involved, especially if you were presented with several good-looking men and meeting the same qualifiers. How would you select who's the informant use? And I think that's where I would say that there's personal biases coming in, and I recognize that in the process. And now, lastly, this is very important because in the research that I do right now, some of the sex workers I've met in the gay bars have started to do things online. So to some extent, I am now in the position that I'm following the body already. My research has become somehow multi-sided from offline to online context. There were a disruption of the research process basically because of COVID, but the trajectory that I am in right now, especially the one that I do in Cambridge, is more of a continuity of the research process, albeit in a different context. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much to our panelists. I am going to find a way to pin us all. Pin. Very good. Now I just need to do it for Katie. This is helping me learn Zoom. All right, we have all of us been very good. So I would now like to invite people to ask questions. So Jennifer has messaged me with a question. Maybe we can start with that, Jennifer. You can just unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I was not allowed to unmute myself until just now. So Unmuted has started. Thank you all for your presentations and for this incredibly important panel. Katie, I wanted to ask you a kind of offer a half comment and get your advice. It's a pretty practical question. As you were talking about IRB, so that's the specific institutional review boards in the US, I so appreciate your note about just the discretion that IRBs wield. And I would just add to that, in my experience, there's also such disparities across institutions. So the kind of discretionary power that might be specific to one institution, I've just experienced such variety. So that's the comment. The specific area that I've faced a lot of pushback, especially in the last, I'd say 5 years, as sex worker rights activists and organizers have been so clear and keen to put together a kind of, amount, like what is a reasonable amount to offer folks for their participation and expertise. And the challenge I face with IRBs is being consistently told that it's too much. So offering what is perceived by IRBs is too much to kind of be a coercive incentive, that it's, it would make people who wouldn't the perception is people who wouldn't otherwise participate would if I would offer the amount that sex worker rights groups had, say is kind of the baseline. And relatedly, sex worker rights groups, in my experience, not wanting gift cards, but IRB saying I should offer gift cards. So cash incentives seem preferred over gift cards. So this is a long-winded way to ask, have you and perhaps folks you're talking to and working with come up with some strategies for how to educate IRBs, and maybe the ways we can, maybe I'm just keen to learn how we can maybe take this collective expertise to try to not, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the cash thing in the US, you all actually have a huge leg up that NIH just released guidance several years ago saying that cash is the preferred incentive mode. So this is really the best like practices. And I just, every time IRBs in the US tell me this, I just refer them to that. And I'm happy to send it along. If I run into an IRB that's particularly stubborn about it, what I've just done instead is offered US Post Office money orders, which people can cash as cash without basically without even having an ID. And the I hope Jennifer's still there, I'm not sure. And the benefit for the IRB is that it is something that is trackable, which is often what IRBs come back with, is that cash isn't trackable for auditing purposes, and therefore money orders are. So I just say, well, I'm just going to use money orders then. As for the amount, I feel like I get this all the time, and my advice, and this may seem a little flip, but I participate in a lot of research myself. And I think that's really important across a lot of different schools and sectors. But particularly in psychology, which sounds really funny, psychology tends to not have all the pushback around giving incentives to their participants because they're engaging the general public. And so I know if I participate in a psychology project, I will get a $25 gift certificate, which I now on principle just use to buy wine because I'm so annoyed with my IRBs telling me that I can't give cash to participants because they'll buy drugs. So I just go buy legal drugs with it. So anyway, but I know that I'll get $25 for a half an hour participation to do a simple project. And so because of that, I can point to that which has already been approved and say, okay, well, this interview is going to be twice that amount of time. So therefore, this $50 incentive is very reasonable. The other thing that we've had some success doing in Australia is just pointing to minimum wages, which are quite high here. I would not recommend doing this in the US, but in Australia or in Europe, we've pointed to minimum wage and noted that what IRBs are recommending is less than minimum wage for the time allowed. And they're including super and all of that. And therefore, this would be really immoral on our part to give someone money that was less than minimum wage for essentially an hour. And that has been successful. But yeah, I've gotten exactly the exact same comments. And I really do think it is rooted in this view of sex workers and also youth. I also work with young people who are couch surfing, and this idea that they fit into that damage-centered or that deviant mold, and therefore we can't trust them with money, essentially, which is really paternalistic.
Sorry, let me just unmute Jennifer. Where is it? There you go. Can you now?
Yeah, Katie, I just wanted to thank you, and your note about youth too. And I should have clarified, youth has it seems a lot more tricky because of the perception about what is a reasonable amount. So thank you, and I appreciate Doris's shares as well.
Yeah, I would just add to this because I also ran into this problem when I was proposing to my PhD ethics committee that I had to pay interviewees. So the way I argued it was to say, well, this is a small honorarium for their time, plus compensating them for travel costs and food. I do think a case can be made that this is, intellectual and emotional labor that is being asked of the participants. And if the point of the research is to argue that, we're correcting epistemic injustice and sex workers are authorities on their own lives, this is paying them for their expertise as well. And so, yeah, I was able to make a case, but I had to reduce the amount in the end. Anyone else on the panel with thoughts on this? Questions of compensation in research? Doris?
Yeah, I was going to say it's funny the different perspectives. Like, so in Ireland, or in UCC, I suppose is all I can speak to. This was the kind of comment that I got, and so it was much more about the idea of sex work, and again, those kind of binary views of sex work were what they seem to be grappling with. They didn't give a hoot about the remuneration. Like, I just ticked that I would be paying them and said it's the done thing, I will be giving them whatever, and that wasn't an issue at all. Whereas I got back a lot of back and forth about sex work, and in conversation with a friend of mine and a fellow colleague who is a male researcher of sex work, he said he does not get any of those. So it's just so interesting that, like, they obviously thought that I might be at fierce risk from some dangerous man, is about the height of it, and it just took so many back and forths to explain that, because I was working with community organizations and everything else, like, and I should say as well, I'm very lucky. Maggie O'Neill is my supervisor, so has 30 years or more, I don't know, experience of doing this research. So, like, we know how to do the kind of safety guidelines bits. So compensation wise, they weren't bothered. But interestingly, I have an Irish Research Council scholarship, and I'm not allowed to use my expenses for paying participants. So I get, and that's, I assume it's for all of the reasons we've talked about. But that's something that definitely needs changing. Now, it's fine, I'm paying them because I'm like, well, as we've talked about, I can't do the research without them, so I'm just paying them from my stipend. But it's, it obviously is a valid research expense, so that needs changing, but I didn't have the teeth for that just yet.
Yeah. And Doris, I just, reading your comment, I mean, this was exactly the type of comment that I've received, that I kind of created that, again, what I call the PIMP protocol, because it just imagines this really ridiculous, violent scenario. And I mean, what was so funny for me was, again, I was doing this research. So this was when I was doing research on gentrification along sex work strolls in DC. And I had volunteered with the Syringe Exchange for 6 years at that point, that goes out overnight in Washington, DC, and to, what I think most people would classify as quite like a high crime neighborhoods. And so I mean, I felt very comfortable in these neighborhoods, but also could talk quite candidly about the risks associated with being there. And just kind of this imagined scenario of the violent man. I mean, there's also, it's in the US, it's very tinged with racism as well. But here it's just, I had to like continually put together every time I would put in an amendment, something that just kind of had to address this possibility for violence that just didn't exist. And there was no kind of explaining that this violence didn't exist. It was like I had to be prepared for it. And in this way, that was just impossible and nonsensical.
Yeah, and like, as I say, because obviously of, say, so my supervision and all of the rest of it, we had prepared it all. And again, I had read all of, I say, like that article I shared there, that's very specific about trying to actually overcome these difficulties. So I put in all like the necessary bits, but interestingly, what came back, and so Maggie said that she had never, ever had so much back and forth in any institution she's been in. And she's obviously supervised so many, sex work related PhDs. It was 100% trying to overcome this state feminism, carceral feminism thing, because they came back saying, it doesn't seem like you've actually really consulted the research. And they basically asked for like practically a lit review of sex work and ethics. And I was like, that's not what this form is, like you, and again, Maggie had signed off on it. So, but they were like, you mustn't actually know what you're getting yourself into, So anyway, we came back and we got it sorted.
Okay. Michael, do you have any thoughts on payment? Compensation?
This one was very tricky in my case, because I think, as I've mentioned, entering the game was already transactional. as a kind of research. So that already makes it very expensive. And given that I did this for my undergrad and for my master's in the Philippines, I didn't have any institutional support or grant to do this. So everything came out of my own pocket. So that was really one of the difficulties when it comes to payment. I have employed certain strategies, and one way that I have made sure that the dancers were compensated well was this. I always base it on how much they receive from the drinks that I purchase for them. That's one way for me to know. So it's like when I ask them, how much is one set of drink? That's like around $20, 20 US dollars. So I'm like, how much do you get there? Around 40% of it. So that's like roughly around 40%. Sorry, I do them $8 or something. Yeah, I think around $8. So on top of that $8 commission or cut that they would receive from the drink, I would match it with pretty much around $10 compensation. So as a form of gratuity for their time. So which means they were already compensated with the drink that I purchased for them, but I still give them on top of that as a gratuity because I recognize the fact that they are entertainers. So no matter how conversant they may be, they have to confront that I'm not asking them the questions that they were expected to answer, because initially they thought that I would be asking them about the stories of their lives. And then all of a sudden, when I asked them like, how do you do the dance? And all of them were so unprepared. Like we didn't expect that someone like you would ask us about the very work that we do. I thought most of you would be interested with what our lives and struggles are. And I think it was also a very conscious decision because I think some stories have been very much evident in sex work. I mean, we recognize that there are a wide variety of stories of struggle and everything else, but we want to explore something else because there's already that intellectual bias that, you know, it's all about some stories. There's nothing new to say, but we always want to tell them, no, there's a lot more to be said. There's a lot more unpacking that needs to be done. And then with my second fieldwork, the next challenge was I have no control who are the informants that I am receiving because I was already dealing with several establishments, several owners this time. So what happened was one of the strategy I did was if ever there's an informant that would specifically ask for an amount, like for example, beyond what I originally formulated, meaning that amount of the commission plus a fixed amount, they should automatically be excluded from the list. I would not get them as data source because that is where exploitation comes in. The justification was there. Because why do you have to pay a specific informant a higher compensation over the others? What makes this person much more valuable than the other one? Because once I do that, that in itself is already an indication of exploitation that challenges the very ethical or, you know, the epistemic location that you are telling, that you want to give credence to what they are saying, but you also don't want to disenfranchise your other informants. So those kinds of negotiations have been very much apparent and consistent all throughout.
Okay. Thank you for that. We have a question now from Vaughn. So let me try to unmute you, Vaughn. Hang on. Is Vaughn still on the call? Yes, and is unmuted. Very good. Yeah, I will pause the recording.
Of who the appeal is being sent to, but is the same problem that I pointed out, which is the appeal reviewers ended up being from the same professional kind of circle as the head of our IRB. And so I think that they largely were bringing that same kind of viewpoint. They were not, it was not actually sent to people in either employment discrimination law, which I would have expected a very different response from, or from within the sex worker community, which I very much would have expected a different response from. So it's pretty puzzling. I mean, I also was just shocked that they shut down the methodology specifically, because I think that has even larger repercussions for doing any type of discrimination-based research. And so that, you know, I completely agree. I think that it's a problem on kind of many levels. At the same time, I do wrestle with this a little bit, because I will admit that I don't know that I'm someone who believes that research should only always be carried out by someone with lived experience. And I think that there can be really important insights brought, by people who are kind of approaching this with not all that, I say baggage with absolutely all the love in my heart, but who don't have that same kind of visceral reaction to everything else that kind of attends to being a member of community. And I think that's important as well. So, you know, I go back and forth about, you know, how to address these kind of issues in terms of inviting or including peers in kind of every step of the process and what that ends up looking like. I know that's probably a very unsatisfactory answer, and I'm sorry that I don't have kind of a cut and dry response in some ways. I think in many ways it just there needs to be some way, as you noted, to ensure that that IRBs or ethics committees are taking that step back to allow that space for particularly disadvantaged and marginalized communities to step up and say, this is something we want. It's really something we want. And when that is kind of the overwhelming voice, then I think that university committee does in some ways need to step aside, or they need to restrict their role to a very much an advisory one of saying, okay, we've essentially checked to make sure that you've crossed your T's and dotted your I's. So.
Yeah, I think one bit that needs to be emphasized here is that ethics committees also are quite risk averse. A lot of it is about managing risk for the university, and
Absolutely.
And once you're operating from that framework, you default to certain preconceptions about what types of people and communities are risky and dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, I was told that I can't do research with sex workers in their houses, and I was like, so you want me to ask them about traumatic experiences and their lives in public parks and settings in a country where they are criminalized? You know what I mean? So yeah, this mismatch is real, I guess. All right, I think we have time for at least one more question too, if we're lucky. So does anyone else have any questions for the panel? Just say it on the chat and then we'll unmute you.
Can I just comment on Vaughn's comment in the meantime?
Sure.
I just totally agree, and it's just commenting on on what you said as well, Sharmila, and that idea of, you know, I don't know, here they call it cover your arse, insurance, you know, it's totally risk averse. And so, because I was up to high dough about the whole thing, very worried and stressed about trying to get it through, because I was like, how will I do my lovely research project if I can't get it through the committee? And a friend from a different profession altogether just said, play the game, give them what they want to hear. So use, you know, whether it's Katie's PIMP protocol or Monique and Tila's ideas, just play the game, give them what they want to hear without lying, you know, that you're just saying things in as basic a way as possible, and then go on and do your beautiful research and maybe make change with it, you know.
Yep. Any other questions from the group? Okay, maybe I'll just leave a last question for the panel, which is that, so I think to a certain extent, we need to acknowledge that academic, you know, research is inevitably implicated in an extractive process, right? Like, there's no way around that. And even with the best intentions, all research involves extracting from the other, right? To produce knowledge. And there's always a degree of objectification, of speaking about, of speaking for that occurs. That's just part of the process. So maybe if you can very briefly, like maybe a minute per speaker, talk through all the other things you've done to try to mitigate this extractivism in the process that we might not have covered yet, that would be good. Yeah.
Michael, do you want to go first?
Okay. I I think in my case, I've shown that I'm very, very careful with how I get data from my informants, because as much as possible, I give them full ownership of it. So which means that if I need to censor information that they think is I should not include, at least, I give them that sense of control. Because at least that way, I recognize that I do get information from them, but I still give them the full power of it. I think that's very important because we are writing about their lives. So we have to be as truthful as possible. We have to be as transparent as possible. And sometimes we also have to contest the problem with ethics committees or examiners or reviewers that, is this the only information you got? And then we always have to make that defense. We cannot include something that our participants specifically don't want us to include. We cannot even discuss them in limitations, what the intricacies of these details are, because as much as we extract, we also want to protect them. Because sometimes some of the information that they choose to not disclose are actually maybe harmful, can be used against them in some form or another that we might not know of or we might be unaware. So I think that's how I would really respond to this problem of extractivism. And so on a last note, especially with my research right now that I'm doing everything online, even the notions of copyright and ownership of images, I specifically ask the sex workers themselves, can I use your photos? Because even if it's in a public domain, I still have to recognize their ownership and copyright, because they have the right to know how am I gonna use their data. Just simply because it's out there in the open doesn't mean you can use it irresponsibly. I think it's also one way to do it. We have to be ethical in every step of the way.
I think the ethics of representation is very, very important in terms of photos and all that.
Yes.
So thanks, Michael. Doris, Katie, any last words? To keep it to a minute each, if possible.
Yeah, I think there's loads of good research done on rigorous research ethics. So it's just applying it to us in our careful way. So member checking or whatever. Like now they say that, I'm like, that sounds like penis checking, but checking back with them to make sure that the transcripts, like letting people, and again, if people want to, if that's more work for somebody, no biggie, or literacy issues that you might read it back to them, etc. So letting them check that you've represented their words as they've said them. I'm trying to work through how to do kind of shared analysis. My people don't want me to, because they questions of ownership and blah blah blah, but I disagree. So trying to work out how for each person, that how they would like to do that or what way to go about it. And then I'm also like, every time I go to something new, I'm like, maybe I could do that instead. Where, say for example, people are talking about, letting people's own stories like be the chapter, but working out how to do that.
Yep. And again, academia and how knowledge production is so individualized, right? It's very hard to share credit in a strict PhD program. I also struggled with that. Katie, any last words?
So I think my way of dealing with this is that I just have gotten tired of doing research on sex workers, and I don't think that it is something that should be the long-term goal of researchers who focus on sex work. I think, as we've kind of established today, there are many more gatekeepers that influence and harm sex working communities, and I think it is a much more worthwhile pursuit to turn our focus towards those people than continuing to come back to the same strolls or the same clubs over and over again and ask people the same kind of questions. I mean, Michael, that's so fascinating to me that everyone was kind of anticipating the questions you had, and they were just like, oh, this is different, which is great. That's exactly what you want. So yeah, I mean, I think that's how I've kind of wrestled with this or reconciled this with myself, is moving on to focus on other people who impact sex workers' lives, and showing that is a worthy place to do research. So yeah.
All right. Someone now write a book about how ethics boards are not equipped to review sex work research proposals. Great. Okay.
Would really love that. Would really love that.
All right.
It's the big philosophical question.
Yeah. Thank you so much to this panel. Let's take a 12-minute break. See everyone here at 15, so 11:15 UK time, for our last panel. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was
Thanks,
great.
everyone.